The morning sun of Valaxis Prime cast purple light through the tall windows of classroom 7B at the Galactic Cooperative Academy, and Professor Velthrix stood at the front of the room with her thin arms folded behind her back as she waited for her students to settle into their seats. She was a Veshan, tall and willowy with skin so thin you could almost see through it, and her body glowed with soft bioluminescent patterns that shifted color based on her mood. And right now, those patterns were a calm blue-green that told her students she was in a good mood. Classroom held 37 students from 12 different species, and they came from all corners of the known galaxy to study at this prestigious academy. And most of them were nervous because today was the day. Professor Velthrix would announce the first major assignment of the semester. In the front row sat a cluster of Florians, plant-like beings with green skin and leaves that grew from their heads instead of hair. And they whispered to each other in rustling voices that sounded like wind through trees. Behind them were 3 crystallids, beings made of living crystal that caught the purple sunlight and scattered it into rainbows across the walls. And they sat perfectly still because their species did not fidget, the way others did. A group of Violux students occupied the middle rows, their fuzzy bodies constantly shifting colors as they tried to regulate their temperature in the climate-controlled room. And they looked like large, friendly caterpillars that had learned to walk upright. And in the very back row, sitting alone with an empty seat on either side of him, was Marcus Chen. Marcus was 18 years old, and he was the first human to ever attend the Galactic Cooperative Academy as an exchange student. And he was aware that the empty seats around him were not an accident because the other students were afraid to sit too close. He did not blame them for their fear because he understood what humans represented to the rest of the galaxy. And the word they used for his kind was Deathworlder, which was not meant as a compliment to Earth, was classified as a Class 12 planet, which meant it was considered one of the most hostile environments in the known galaxy, where intelligent life had somehow managed to evolve. And the fact that humans had not only survived, but thrived on such a world made other species very nervous. The air on Earth was 21% oxygen, which most species considered a corrosive poison that would burn their lungs from the inside. And humans breathed it like it was nothing because to them it was nothing. The gravity on Earth was crushing compared to most inhabited worlds. And yet humans walked around on 2 legs without any mechanical assistance. And some of them even ran for fun, which was a concept that horrified the lighter gravity species. And then there was the star that Earth orbited, a yellow dwarf that bombarded the planet with radiation that would give most species cancer within minutes of exposure. And humans just called it sunshine and complained when there was not enough of it. Marcus knew all of this because the cooperative had given him extensive briefings before allowing him to attend the academy. And they had asked him very politely to try not to frighten the other students. He had promised to do his best. And so far he had done well by keeping his mouth closed when he smiled so nobody would see his teeth, and by moving slowly so his predator-fast reflexes would not trigger anyone's prey instincts, and by speaking softly so his deep human voice would not sound like a growl. Professor Velthrix tapped her podium with one long finger to get the class's attention, and her bioluminescence shifted to a professional white gold. That meant she was about to say something important. "Good morning, students," she said in her melodic voice that sounded like someone playing a flute underwater. "Today I will be giving you your first assignment for Introduction to Xenobiology. And I want you all to know that this is meant to be a simple project to help us appreciate the wonderful diversity of life in our galaxy." The students leaned forward with interest, and Marcus pulled out his tablet to take notes because he wanted to make a good impression. "Your assignment is to document your species' evolutionary adaptations," Professor Velthrix continued. "You will create a presentation that explains how your ancestors survived and thrived on your homeworld. And you will include visual evidence, such as photographs or diagrams, to help your classmates understand. A Florian in the front row raised a leafy hand and asked what kind of adaptations they should focus on. And Professor Velthrix's glow turned a warm, encouraging yellow. Anything that makes your species unique, she answered. For example, our Florian friends might discuss their photosynthetic abilities, and the crystallids could explain their silicon-based biology, and the Velux might demonstrate their remarkable color-changing abilities. She looked around the room with what Marcus assumed was a smile. Though Thesians did not have mouths in the traditional sense, and instead communicated partly through their glowing patterns, this should be a fun and easy assignment, she said. Nothing too complicated. Just a chance to share what makes each of us special. Marcus looked down at his tablet and typed out some quick notes about what he might include in his presentation. And he felt relieved because this really did seem like an easy assignment. He could talk about human endurance, which was something he found interesting from a biological standpoint. And he could discuss the immune system, which was honestly pretty cool when you thought about it. And maybe he could include some information about how humans had adapted to live in almost every environment on Earth, from frozen tundras to burning deserts. More he thought about it, the more excited he became, because he had always been proud of human resilience. And this was a chance to share that with his new classmates. He had no idea that his definition of simple evolutionary adaptations was very different from what the rest of the class would present. He had no idea that the things he considered normal and even boring about human biology would send his classmates into psychological distress. He had no idea that his easy homework assignment was about to become the most talked about presentation in the history of the Galactic Cooperative Academy. All he knew was that he had 3 days to put together something interesting, and he was determined to do a good job. As the class ended and students filed out of the room, a Velux named Crix brushed past Marcus on their way to the door, and their fur shifted to a nervous gray color as they made brief eye contact. "Good luck with your presentation," Crix said in a voice that trembled slightly. "I am sure it will be very, educational." Marcus smiled with his lips pressed together to hide his teeth and thanked Crix for the kind words. And he wondered why the Velux had looked so scared when this was supposed to be such a simple assignment. He would understand soon enough. 3 days passed quickly at the Galactic Cooperative Academy, and before Marcus knew it, the morning of the presentations had arrived, and he found himself sitting in the back row of classroom 7B with his tablet in his hands and his heart beating just a little faster than normal. He had worked hard on his presentation, and he was proud of what he had put together. And he thought the other students would find it interesting to learn about human biology, because most of them had probably never met a human before. The classroom was full, and Professor Velthrix stood at her podium with her bioluminescence glowing a calm, encouraging blue as she called the first student to present. A Florian named Petal walked to the front of the room, and their presentation was exactly what Professor Velthrix had described as an example during the assignment briefing. Petal showed beautiful images of Florians standing in sunlight with their leaf hair spread wide to absorb energy, and they explained how their species had evolved on a world with very weak sunlight, which forced them to become extremely efficient at photosynthesis. The class watched politely and asked a few gentle questions, and Professor Velthrix's glow turned a pleased golden color as she thanked Petal for the lovely presentation. Next came a crystallid named Facet, whose presentation focused on how their species had evolved to process minerals from their rocky homeworld and incorporate those minerals into their crystalline bodies. Facet showed diagrams of how different minerals created different colors and patterns in crystallid skin, and they demonstrated by holding up a piece of copper ore and explaining that if they ate it, their left arm would turn slightly more blue. Over the next few weeks, the class found this fascinating, and several students asked questions about what happened if a crystallid ate something they were not supposed to. And Facet explained that their bodies simply rejected incompatible materials without any harm. Then it was Crix's turn, and the Valak student walked to the front on their many stubby legs while their fur cycled through nervous gray colors. Crix's presentation was about temperature regulation through color changing, and they demonstrated by thinking happy thoughts which turned their fur a warm orange, and then thinking scary thoughts which turned their fur a cold blue. The class applauded politely, and Professor Velfrix's glow was practically golden with satisfaction, because everything was going exactly as she had hoped. And then she called Marcus Chun's name. Room went very quiet as Marcus stood up from his seat, and he could feel 36 pairs of eyes following him as he walked down the aisle toward the front of the classroom. His footsteps seemed louder than everyone else's had been, and he realized that was because human feet were designed to support a much heavier body and much stronger gravity. And each step he took made a solid thump against the floor that the other students could probably feel through their seats. Several students shifted away from the aisle as he passed, and Marcus pretended not to notice because he did not want to make anyone uncomfortable. He reached the front of the room and connected his tablet to the display screen, and he took a deep breath and reminded himself to speak softly and smile without showing his teeth. "Hello, everyone," he said in the gentlest voice he could manage. "My name is Marcus Chun, and I am from Earth. And today I'm going to tell you about some of the ways humans adapted to survive on our planet." He pulled up his first slide, which showed a photograph of the African savanna with a human figure running across it. One of the most important adaptations humans developed was the ability to hunt through persistence, Marcus explained. You see, humans are not the fastest animals on Earth. And in fact, most of the animals we used to hunt could outrun us easily in a short sprint. He paused to make sure everyone was following along, and he noticed that several students had gone very still, but he assumed they were just paying close attention. But here is the interesting part. He continued, "Humans do not need to be fast because we have incredible endurance, and we can keep moving at a steady pace for hours and hours without stopping. And eventually, the animals we were chasing would collapse from exhaustion because they could not keep running forever." A Theshan student in the third row made a small sound, and Marcus saw that their bioluminescence had flickered into an orange-red pattern he did not recognize. "This is called persistence hunting," Marcus said. "And the reason we can do it is because of our cooling system." Which brings me to my next slide. He clicked to an image showing a diagram of human skin with sweat glands highlighted. Humans have these things called sweat glands all over our bodies, he explained. And when we get hot, these glands release water onto our skin. And when that water evaporates, it carries heat away from our body. And this lets us keep moving, even when other animals would overheat and die. The Velux student Crix had turned completely white, which Marcus did not know was the Velux color for extreme fear. Most Earth animals can only cool down by panting, Marcus continued, which means they have to stop running to catch their breath. But humans can sweat and breathe at the same time. So we just keep going and going until our prey cannot run anymore. He smiled at the class, forgetting for just a moment to keep his lips pressed together. And 36 students suddenly found themselves staring at the white bone protrusions in his mouth. Those were teeth. They realized with horror, those were the tools his ancestors had used to tear meat from the bodies of animals they had chased to death. Florian in the front row began photosynthesizing so rapidly that small bubbles of oxygen started forming on their leaves, which was apparently what Florians did when they were experiencing extreme stress. Professor Velthrix's bioluminescence had gone dim, almost gray, and she gripped her podium with thin fingers that had turned pale. Marcus did not notice any of this, because he was looking at his slides and thinking about what to say next. And he was pleased with how well his presentation seemed to be going, because everyone was so quiet and attentive. He had no idea that the silence was not attention, but shock. He had no idea that his classmates were not fascinated, but terrified. He had no idea that he had just described, in simple and casual terms, a hunting method that most species in the galaxy would consider psychological torture to Marcus. Persistence hunting was just an interesting fact about human history, something his ancestors had done a long time ago, before they invented grocery stores and fast food restaurants. But to his classmates, he had just revealed that humans were patient, relentless predators who did not need to be fast or strong, because they would simply follow you until you dropped dead from exhaustion. And the worst part was that he was still smiling. "Should I continue to the next section?" Marcus asked brightly. "I have a lot more to share about human biology." Nobody said no, because nobody could find their voice to speak. Marcus took their silence as encouragement and clicked to his next slide. Marcus clicked to his next slide with enthusiasm, because he thought this section of his presentation was particularly interesting, and he had spent a lot of time putting together the images and diagrams to make it easy for his classmates to understand. "Now I want to talk about one of my favorite things about human biology," he said, "and that is our ability to heal from injuries." The slide showed a photograph of a human arm with a long scar running down it, and the image was annotated with labels pointing to different types of tissue. "This is actually my arm," Marcus explained. "I took this picture a few years ago after I fell off my bicycle and broke my radius, which is one of the bones in the forearm." A crystallid student in the third row made a sound like glass cracking under pressure, and Marcus assumed they were just clearing their throat or whatever crystallids did when they needed to make noise. "The break was pretty bad," Marcus continued. "It was what we call a compound fracture, which means the bone actually came through my skin and was sticking out of my arm." The classroom went completely silent, and several students had stopped breathing, because their species did not require constant oxygen intake the way humans did. "I remember it hurt a lot," Marcus said casually, "and there was quite a bit of blood. But my parents took me to the hospital, and the doctors put the bone back in place and wrapped my arm in a cast to keep it still." He clicked to the next image, which showed an X-ray of the same arm with the bone clearly broken in two pieces. "Here you can see the fracture on the X-ray," he pointed out. "The bone was completely separated. But that is okay, because human bones can regrow and fuse back together on their own." A Florian student made a sound like a tree branch snapping in a storm, and two of their classmates reached out to steady them because they looked like they might fall out of their chair. "It took about 6 weeks for the bone to heal completely," Marcus said, "and during that time I could not use my arm very much. But after the cast came off, I just did some exercises to rebuild the muscle, and now my arm works perfectly fine." He rolled up his sleeve to show the class his forearm, where a faint white line was barely visible against his skin. "See," he said proudly, "you can hardly even tell it was ever broken. And that bone is actually stronger now than it was before because of how it healed." Professor Velfrix made a small whimpering sound that her species usually only produced when experiencing severe emotional distress, and her bioluminescence had gone almost completely dark, which was the Thesian equivalent of being about to faint. But Marcus did not know Thesian body language well enough to recognize the warning signs, and he thought the professor was just standing very still to listen carefully. "Human bodies are really good at repairing themselves," he continued. "We can heal from cuts and burns and broken bones, and even some internal injuries without any special medical treatment. Although medicine definitely helps speed things up." He clicked to another slide, showing a diagram of the human healing process, with labels for things like blood clotting, and tissue regeneration and scar formation. When you cut a human, the first thing that happens is the blood clots to stop the bleeding, Marcus explained. These tiny cell fragments called platelets rush to the wound and stick together to form a plug. And then proteins in the blood create a mesh of fibers that holds everything in place. A Velux student had turned so pale that they were almost transparent. And their neighbor was gently patting them with a furry appendage and what seemed to be an attempt at comfort. Then white blood cells come in to fight off any bacteria that might have gotten into the wound. Marcus continued, because Earth is covered in microorganisms that would love to infect an open wound and cause serious problems. He said this like it was perfectly normal. Like living on a planet where invisible creatures were constantly trying to invade. Your body was just an ordinary fact of life. After a few days, the body starts building new tissue to close the wound, Marcus said. Special cells called fibroblasts produce collagen, which is a protein that forms the structure of skin and other tissues. And slowly the wound closes up from the inside out. He showed another image. This one of a healing cut at various stages from fresh wound to faint scar. The whole process usually takes a few weeks for a minor cut, he explained. Bigger injuries take longer, but the body just keeps working on it until everything is fixed. A Russian student in the second row had started crying, and their tears glowed a soft blue color as they rolled down their translucent cheeks. Marcus noticed this and felt a moment of concern, wondering if he had said something wrong. But then he remembered that different species had different emotional responses, and maybe Russians just cried when they were interested in something. Oh, and here is something really cool, he said, clicking to his next slide. Sometimes human bodies cannot fix themselves completely, but we have figured out ways to work around that. The slide showed an image of a prosthetic leg, sleek and metallic and designed to look almost like a natural limb. If someone loses an arm or a leg, we can build them a new one out of metal and plastic, Marcus explained. These prosthetics can connect to the person's nervous system and move almost like a real limb. And some of them are even stronger than the original body part. He clicked again to show a different type of medical intervention. And if someone's internal organs stop working, we can sometimes transplant organs from another person, he said, or even from other species in some cases. Like using heart valves from pigs to replace damaged human heart valves. The crystallid student who had made the cracking sound earlier suddenly shattered a small piece of their own exterior plating, and the crystalline fragments scattered across their desk with a musical tinkling sound. We can also transplant blood, Marcus added, which is useful because humans sometimes lose a lot of blood from injuries and need to be refilled. So we have these things called blood banks where people donate their blood to be stored for emergencies. He paused and looked around the room with a smile, and he noticed that everyone seemed very quiet and very still. Is everyone doing okay? He asked. I know this is a lot of information, but I think it is really interesting how the human body can repair and replace itself. And I wanted to share that with all of you. Nobody responded. Professor Velfrix opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out, and her bioluminescence flickered weakly like a dying light. Marcus waited a moment longer, then shrugged and decided to move on to the next section of his presentation. He had no idea that his classmates were not quiet, because they were interested. He had no idea that they were trying to process the fact that humans could break their own bones through their own skin and just heal from it like it was a minor inconvenience. He had no idea that the concept of transplanting organs from one person to another, or even from other species, was something most civilizations in the galaxy considered the stuff of horror stories to Marcus. These were just normal medical facts that everyone on Earth learned and schooled his classmates. He had just described a species that could be damaged in ways that would kill any other creature, and then simply put themselves back together and keep going. The presentation was not even halfway over, And already half the class was showing signs of psychological trauma, but Marcus just smiled and clicked to his next slide, ready to share even more fascinating facts about human biology. Marcus was starting to feel like something might be wrong because the classroom was so quiet. He could hear the ventilation system humming in the ceiling, and several of his classmates had stopped moving entirely, which seemed unusual even for species that did not fidget. But he had worked hard on this presentation, and he did not want to leave anything out. So he decided to keep going and hoped that everyone was just very focused on learning. Okay, so I was going to talk about the human immune system next, he said. But I am getting the feeling that might be too much information. So let me skip ahead to something simpler. A Volux student let out a small sound of relief, and their fur shifted from terrified white to a slightly less terrified gray. Instead, I will talk about environmental tolerances, Marcus said, clicking to a new slide that showed a graph with temperature ranges and survival limits. This is one of my favorite topics because I think it really shows how adaptable humans can be. The graph displayed a range from -50 degrees Celsius to +60 degrees Celsius, with a highlighted zone in the middle labeled comfort range and the outer areas labeled survivable with preparation. So humans are most comfortable between about 15 and 30 degrees Celsius, Marcus explained. But we can survive in much more extreme temperatures if we need to. And we have colonized almost every environment on Earth, from frozen tundras to burning deserts. He pointed to the cold end of the graph, where the temperatures drop well below freezing. There are humans who live in places like Antarctica, which is the coldest continent on Earth, he said. The temperatures there can drop to -40 or even -50 degrees, which would kill most species instantly. But humans just put on warm clothes and keep going. Florian's student made a distressed rustling sound because their species came from a tropical world and could not survive temperatures below about 10 degrees Celsius. And on the other end, Marcus continued, pointing to the hot side of the graph. There are humans who live in deserts where the temperature can reach 50 or even 60 degrees during the day. And they have adapted by doing most of their activities at night and drinking lots of water. He clicked to show a photograph of a human standing in the Sahara Desert with sand dunes stretching to the horizon behind them. This is a place called the Sahara, he said. It is one of the hottest places on Earth. And yet people have been living there for thousands of years because humans are just really good at adapting to extreme conditions. Professor Velthrix made a small sound, and when Marcus looked at her, he noticed that her bioluminescence was flickering in patterns he had never seen before, almost like she was having trouble maintaining her emotional stability. "Are you okay, Professor?" he asked with genuine concern. The Theshan did not respond, and Marcus decided she probably just needed a moment to process all the information. So he continued with his presentation. "Now here is something I find really interesting," he said, clicking to a new slide that showed a photograph of Mount Everest. Some humans climb to the top of very tall mountains just for fun, even though the conditions there are incredibly dangerous. The image showed the snow-covered peak of Earth's highest mountain, with tiny figures of climbers visible against the white landscape. Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth, Marcus explained. And at the top, the air is so thin that there is barely enough oxygen to breathe. And most humans would pass out within minutes without supplemental oxygen. A crystallid student made another cracking sound. And this time, a visible fracture appeared in their crystalline exterior that their neighbor pointed at with obvious concern. But some humans climb it anyway, Marcus continued. They spend months training and preparing, and then they spend weeks climbing up the mountain. And many of them do it without extra oxygen because they want to prove they can survive in conditions that should kill them. He clicked to show a photograph of a human at the summit of Everest, grinning at the camera with frost on their face and ice crystals in their hair. This is called extreme sports, Marcus said. And humans do all kinds of things like this just for fun, like jumping out of airplanes or diving to the bottom of the ocean or running through burning buildings. A Russian student began crying again, and this time their tears were glowing a deep red color that Marcus suspected might indicate a more intense emotional response than the blue tears from earlier. Wait, I should clarify, Marcus added quickly. The burning building thing is usually only done by firefighters, who are humans specifically trained to rescue people from dangerous situations. They do not just run into fires for no reason. This clarification did not seem to help. And in fact, several students looked even more disturbed by the idea that some humans had chosen to make running into burning buildings their profession. Anyway, Marcus continued. The point is that humans can survive in almost any environment if they have time to prepare. And we have developed technology to help us live in places that should be completely uninhabitable. He clicked to a photograph of the International Space Station, a large structure floating in the blackness of space with Earth visible in the background. This is a space station, he said. Humans built it in orbit around Earth, and there are people living up there right now in the complete vacuum of space, breathing air that they recycle over and drinking water that is purified from their own urine. Multiple students made distressed sounds at this revelation, and Marcus wondered if maybe he should have left out the part about the urine. Oh, and we also walked on our moon, he added, pulling up an image of an astronaut standing on the lunar surface. The moon has no atmosphere at all, so humans had to wear special suits to keep them alive. But they just walked around up there and collected rocks and hit golf balls and then came back home. A Velux student's fur had started cycling through colors so fast that it created a strobe effect, which Marcus suspected was not a good sign. And of course, we have sent robots to explore other planets, he said. But we are working on sending humans too, because apparently surviving on one Deathworld was not challenging enough, and we want to try living on others. He laughed at his own joke, but nobody else laughed with him, and the silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. Is everyone okay? He asked, looking around the room at his classmates. You all seem very quiet. Professor Velthrix finally found her voice, and it came out as a weak whisper that barely carried across the room. Mr. Chun, she said, perhaps we should take a short break. Marcus looked at the time and realized he had been talking for almost 20 minutes, which did seem like a long time, and he nodded in agreement. Sure, he said. I still have a section on venomous creatures and how humans have learned to survive their bites, but I can save that for after the break. A Florian student made a sound like a tree falling in a forest and slumped forward onto their desk, and their classmates immediately rushed to check if they were okay. Marcus watched this with confusion, wondering what could have caused such a reaction. And he still did not understand that it was his presentation that had pushed his classmate past their limits. He just stood at the front of the room, with his tablet in his hands, waiting patiently for the break to end so he could finish sharing all the fascinating facts about human biology that he had prepared. He had no idea that the break would not help. He had no idea that the administrators had already been alerted to a psychological emergency in classroom 7BHE. Had no idea that his simple homework assignment had just become an interstellar incident. All he knew was that he still had 3 more slides to get through, and he was determined to give his classmates a complete and thorough presentation about the amazing adaptability of the human species. The break lasted much longer than Marcus expected, and during that time several things happened that he did not fully understand. First, 3 administrators rushed into classroom 7B with medical equipment and concerned expressions, and they began checking on students who seemed to be in distress, which was most of them. Second, Professor Velthrix was escorted to a chair in the corner of the room where she sat very still with her bioluminescence flickering weakly, while a medical assistant waved some kind of scanning device over her third. 2 students were taken out of the classroom on floating stretchers, including the Florian who had collapsed and a crystallid whose exterior had developed so many stress fractures that they looked like a broken window. Marcus watched all of this from the front of the room where he still stood with his tablet, and he felt a growing sense of worry that he might have done something wrong. "Excuse me," he said to one of the administrators, the elderly Theshan, whose glow was pulsing with alarm. "Is everyone going to be okay?" The administrator turned to look at him, and Marcus saw something in their expression that he had not seen before from any of his classmates. It was not fear exactly, and it was not disgust, and it was not even horror. It was something closer to awe. Like the administrator was looking at something they could not quite believe existed. "Mr. Chun," the administrator said slowly, "what exactly were you presenting to this class?" Marcus held up his tablet and showed them the slide that was still displayed, which was the photograph of the astronaut on the moon. "Just my homework assignment," he said. "We were supposed to talk about our species' evolutionary adaptations, and I was explaining how humans can survive in different environments." The administrator looked at the image, then looked at Marcus, then looked back at the image. "And you showed them this," they said. "You showed them that your species walks on airless worlds for recreation." "Well, it was not exactly recreation," Marcus said. "It was a scientific mission to learn more about the moon and collect samples and prove that humans could survive in space." Which I think is pretty impressive, actually. The administrator made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob, and they turned away to speak quietly with one of the other staff members. Marcus waited patiently, still not entirely sure what was happening, but increasingly aware that his presentation had caused more of a reaction than he had anticipated. Eventually, the Dean of Interspecies Relations arrived, another elderly Theshan whose bioluminescence was cycling through worried patterns, and they asked Marcus to come with them to the diplomatic center for a conversation. "Am I in trouble?" Marcus asked as they walked through the halls of the academy. The dean considered this question for a long moment before answering. "I do not think trouble is the right word," they said. "I think you have simply reminded us of something that we had allowed ourselves to forget." "What is that?" Marcus asked. "That the universe is a dangerous place," the dean said, "and that your species learned to survive in it without the help of anyone else, which is something that most of us cannot even imagine." They reached the diplomatic center, where a group of faculty members and 2 representatives from the Galactic Cooperative Species Relations Council were waiting with tablets and recording devices for the next several hours. Marcus answered questions about everything he had said in his presentation, and he tried to explain that none of it was meant to frighten anyone. "You described hunting creatures by following them until they die," one of the council representatives said. "You do not consider that frightening." "We do not really do that anymore," Marcus said. "We have farms and stores, and most humans have never hunted anything in their lives. But you could do it if you needed to." The representative pressed Marcus, thought about this, and shrugged, because the honest answer was yes. Humans probably could still persistence hunt if their survival depended on it. And lying did not seem like a good idea in a diplomatic situation. "I suppose so," he admitted. The council representatives exchanged glances, and one of them made a note on their tablet that Marcus suspected was not a good sign. "And the healing?" Another questioner asked. "Your bones truly break through your own skin and then repair themselves." "Not always through the skin," Marcus said. "That is just the worst kind of break. Most fractures are much less dramatic, but it happens," they pressed. "Sometimes." Yes, more notes, more exchanged glances, more quiet conversations that Marcus was not invited to participate in. Meanwhile, in the student dormitories, the story of Marcus Chun's presentation was spreading faster than anyone could contain it by dinner time. Every student at the academy knew about the human who had casually described chase hunting prey to death and healing from wounds that would kill any other species, and walking on airless moons for science by the next morning. A recording of the presentation had leaked onto the galactic network, and millions of beings across dozens of worlds were watching Marcus explain persistence hunting with the same cheerful enthusiasm as someone describing their favorite hobby within a week. The video had been viewed more times than any educational content in the history of the Galactic Cooperative, and the comments ranged from terrified to fascinated to deeply impressed. Some species began calling for humans to be reclassified from provisional members to existential concern, arguing that a species capable of such things should not be allowed to move freely through civilized space, but others argued the opposite, saying that this was exactly the kind of ally the cooperative needed in a dangerous universe, and that maybe the other species had become too soft and comfortable in their protected worlds. Marcus followed none of this, because he was busy with his classes and his homework and his attempts to make friends with classmates, who no longer seemed quite so afraid of him. In fact, something strange had happened after his presentation became famous across the galaxy. Instead of being more scared of him, his classmates seemed to have become curious, and they started asking him questions about Earth and humans and whether it was true that his species had invented something called spicy food that was designed to cause pain while eating. Marcus answered their questions as best he could, and he tried not to smile too widely when he did it. And slowly he began to feel like maybe he was finally fitting in. Professor Velthrix eventually recovered enough to return to teaching, and she gave Marcus a grade of exceeds expectations on his assignment, along with a note that read, "Please consult with interspecies relations before any future presentations." Marcus thought this was fair, and he promised to be more careful next time. But then one of his classmates asked him to tell them about the Apollo missions, and Marcus pulled up some footage of rockets launching from Earth with humans strapped inside them, riding controlled explosions into the sky. And the Galactic Cooperative's network servers crashed for 3 hours from the sudden surge in traffic. Marcus Chun had not meant to become famous, and he had not meant to terrify anyone, and he certainly had not meant to cause multiple diplomatic incidents with a simple homework assignment. But that was the thing about humans, that the rest of the galaxy was only beginning to understand what they considered extraordinary. Humans considered ordinary what they considered impossible. Humans considered a challenge and what they considered a simple homework assignment. Well, that could apparently shake the foundations of interstellar civilization. Marcus just smiled with his lips pressed firmly together and wondered what he should do for his next presentation. Maybe something about human history. He thought he had heard that the rest of the galaxy found world wars particularly interesting.